You hand a soccer ball to a toddler and watch what happens next. Nobody teaches them. Nobody has to. Within seconds, they're kicking it, chasing it, trying to keep it away from someone else's feet. You assume that's just instinct meeting a modern invention, a 19th century English sport dropped into a body that happens to enjoy it. But the answer is unimaginable. Humans were building this exact game with these exact instincts on at least 4 separate continents, thousands of years before England ever wrote down a single rule. Not one ancient civilization, several. Separated by oceans neither side knew existed. And almost none of them ever met. Here's the reframe. Soccer wasn't invented in 1863, it was rediscovered in 1863. The Football Association in London didn't create the urge to kick a round object at a target. They were the latest in a chain of civilizations that had already been doing it, in wildly different forms, for over 3,000 years. Start in Mesoamerica because the evidence here goes back the furthest. Archaeologist John Clark, who has spent decades excavating early village sites in what is now southern Mexico, helped uncover a ball court at a site called Paso de la Amada, dated to roughly 1650 BCE. That's not a typo. 1650 BCE. Long before the pyramids of the Maya, long before the Aztec Empire, a farming community had already built a dedicated playing field for a ball game, and built it before they had developed formal class structures or written language. Clark's research suggests something striking. The ball game may not have simply emerged from an already organized society, it may have helped create one. Communities that gathered to watch, bet on, and celebrate these matches needed leaders to organize them, calendars to schedule them, and rules everyone agreed to respect. Sport, in other words, may have helped build civilization rather than the other way around. What did this game actually look like? Picture a long, narrow alley, sometimes stretching nearly the length of a football pitch today, flanked by sloped or vertical walls. Players struck a solid rubber ball, sometimes weighing several pounds, almost entirely with their hips. Hands and feet were largely off-limits. The ball itself came from latex, harvested from rubber trees that grew abundantly across the region, which means Mesoamerican players had something European and Asian ball game cultures simply didn't have access to for thousands more years. A ball that actually bounced. Over 1,300 of these ball courts have been excavated across Central America. This wasn't a regional curiosity. It was one of the most widespread organized sports in the ancient world, and in some versions of the game, the stakes were not just pride. Losing captains in certain periods and regions were sometimes executed. Winning, by contrast, could elevate a player to something close to legendary status. Physical evidence for just how far back this goes is almost hard to believe. In 1992, researchers pulled an actual rubber ball out of a spring at a site called El Manati on Mexico's Gulf Coast. It was more than 3,000 years old. And after 3 millennia underwater, it still smelled faintly of latex. Think about what that means. The exact material science behind the ball you watch professionals strike today, vulcanized feeling rubber capable of holding its shape and bouncing predictably, was already being engineered by Olmec craftsmen, while Bronze Age civilizations elsewhere were still figuring out how to work iron. Now travel across the planet to a civilization that had no way of knowing Mesoamerica existed. In ancient China, as early as the 3rd century BCE, soldiers and citizens played a game called Cuju. The name breaks down simply. Q means kick. Ju means ball. Kickball, essentially, written into Chinese military training manuals as a way to build agility and discipline among troops. Unlike the hip-driven game across the ocean, Cuju was played almost entirely with the feet, making it one of only 2 ancient ball games historians can confirm were foot-dominant rather than hand- or hip-dominant. The ball itself evolved over the centuries from a leather pouch stuffed with feathers into something closer to an inflated bladder. FIFA itself, after reviewing the historical record, has officially recognized Cuju as the earliest known form of a game resembling modern football. Think about that. The international body that governs the sport you watch today looked backward across more than 2,000 years and pointed not to Victorian England, but to Chinese soldiers kicking a feather-stuffed ball between formations. Cuju eventually crossed the sea into Japan, where it transformed into something almost unrecognizable in spirit, even if the basic foot-to-ball mechanics survived. The Japanese version, called Kemari, dropped the competitive scoring entirely. There were no winners, no losers, no goals to defend. Instead, players formed a circle and tried to keep a lightweight deerskin ball aloft using only graceful, cooperative touches for as long as possible. Historians studying Kemari note that it carries the most detailed and reliable historical record of any ancient ball game, largely because of the high social status it held among Japanese nobility for over 1,000 years. Why does that distinction matter? Because it proves something easy to forget. The instinct to control a ball with your feet didn't always serve competition. Sometimes it serves something closer to meditation. Kemari survived for so long, in fact, that it's still occasionally performed today as a ceremonial art at certain shrines in Japan. Players in traditional silk robes keeping a deerskin ball aloft, using the same unhurried touches their ancestors used over 1,000 years ago. Cross back to the Mediterranean, and you find yet another independent branch of the same instinct. In ancient Greece, citizens played a team game called episkyros as early as the 5th century BCE. Historian H.A. Harris, in his influential study of athletic culture in the ancient world, describes episkyros as strikingly modern in its underlying logic. Two teams, a defined boundary line drawn between them. Quick passing under pressure, with each side trying to force the ball past the other's territory. It wasn't soccer. There was no single goal to kick toward. But the core tension, controlled possession contested across a shared space, would feel immediately familiar to anyone watching a match today. The Romans took that Greek foundation and made it rougher. Their version, called harpastum, kept the territorial structure but added wrestling holds, tackles, and a noticeably higher tolerance for violence. Roman writers described matches that lasted for hours, with small leather balls stuffed with feathers or sand passed under heavy physical pressure. As the Roman Empire expanded into Britain, soldiers reportedly brought harpastum with them, planting a version of organized ball sport on British soil more than 1,000 years before the Football Association ever existed. Isn't that a strange thought? The country that gets credit for inventing the modern game may have inherited its very first taste of one from an occupying army. There's a fourth thread worth pulling on, one that almost never makes it into these conversations. Indigenous communities across parts of Australia played a traditional game often called Marn Grook, using a ball made from tightly wound possum skin. Oral histories describe high kicking and leaping to catch the ball before it touched the ground, sometimes played by dozens of participants at once across open grassland. There was no written rulebook the way there was in England, because the tradition was passed down orally across generations rather than codified on paper. But the underlying physical idea, a ball, controlled by the body, contested or celebrated communally, shows up here too on a continent with no contact with Mesoamerica, China, Japan, Greece, or Rome. Here's the counterintuitive twist running underneath all of this. These civilizations had no contact with each other. The Olmec farmers building ball courts in Mexico never heard of Greek athletes drawing boundary lines in dirt fields. Chinese soldiers kicking a feather-stuffed ball had no idea Japanese nobility would later turn the same basic motion into a cooperative ritual. And yet every single one of them arrived, independently, at some version of the same idea. Take a round object, control it without simply carrying it in your arms, and turn that control into either competition or ceremony. That's not a coincidence you can explain with cultural borrowing. It's something closer to a shared feature of how human bodies and human communities naturally organize themselves around a moving object and a goal. What does that tell you about the game you watch today? It tells you soccer isn't really one invention. It's the latest layer on top of a behavior so deeply human that civilizations with zero contact, separated by oceans and millennia, kept stumbling into nearly identical versions of it. England didn't invent the urge. England simply wrote it down first, in a form that happened to spread efficiently through an empire, a language, and eventually a globalized media industry that could broadcast it everywhere at once. Here's the modern mirror to carry with you. The next time you watch a match, or hand a ball to a child and watch them instinctively start kicking it, You're not watching a Victorian English invention play out. You're watching the most recent chapter in a story that includes Olmec farmers building courts before they had writing, Chinese soldiers training their bodies for war, Japanese nobles turning a ball into a meditative circle, Greek athletes drawing the first boundary lines on a field, and communities on a continent with no written records at all, passing the same basic idea down through generations using nothing but memory and demonstration. Every one of those civilizations looked at the same basic problem, a round object and open space, and arrived at strikingly similar answers without ever comparing notes, without a shared language, and in most cases, without ever knowing the others were doing the exact same thing thousands of miles away. You hand a soccer ball to a toddler and watch what happens next. Nobody teaches them. Nobody has to. And now you know why. That instinct isn't new. It's one of the oldest, most repeated behaviors in recorded human history, rediscovered again and again on opposite sides of the planet by people who never once knew the others existed.